Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere that will make your cozy blanket feel like the greatest invention in human history. We are heading to Yakutia, a vast, frozen republic in the Russian Far East where the cold is not just a weather condition, it is a personality. It is a presence. It is the kind of cold that does not merely inconvenience you. It restructures your understanding of what it means to be alive. Temperatures here have plunged to minus 71 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of number that looks like a typo until you realize it is not. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, neither would most of the gear in your garage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments, because wherever you are reading this from, I promise you it is warmer than Yakutia right now. Unless you are in Yakutia, in which case, respect. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of something enormous. Not a cliff, not an ocean, a silence. A white, breathless, continent-scaled silence that stretches from horizon to horizon across the Sakha Republic, which most of the world knows by its older name, Yakutia. This is the largest federal subject of Russia, a territory so immense that if you peeled it off the map and laid it over the continental United States, it would drape comfortably across more than half the country. And yet, despite its staggering size, over 3 million square kilometers, fewer than 1 million people live here. The math alone should tell you something. The land has issued its terms, and most of humanity has declined to sign. But you are here now, at least in imagination, and the first thing you notice is not the snow or the stillness. It is the cold itself, which arrives not as a sensation but as a fact. The moment you step outside in the depths of a Yakutian January, the air does not feel cold the way a refrigerator feels cold, or the way a winter morning in a temperate city feels cold. It feels conclusive. It presses against every exposed centimeter of your skin with a focused, almost bureaucratic efficiency, as though it has a job to do and intends to do it thoroughly. Your nostrils, if you are foolish enough to breathe through them without protection, seal slightly with each inhale as the tiny hairs inside freeze. Your eyelashes, if they carry any moisture at all, begin to frost within seconds. Your breath does not simply mist. It crystallizes into a faint, whispering shower of ice that locals call the whisper of the stars, or in the Sakha language, the diamonds of the air. The physics of what is happening to you are genuinely extraordinary, and understanding them makes the cold feel even more surreal. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, which is the record low recorded near the settlement of Oymyakon and in the broader Yakutian region, you are operating in a temperature range that sits between the surface of Mars on a cold day and the boiling point of liquid nitrogen. To put it another way, minus 71 degrees Celsius is colder than dry ice, which is solid carbon dioxide and already cold enough to cause instant frostbite on contact. At these temperatures, steel becomes brittle and can shatter like glass if struck. Rubber tires crack and crumble. Diesel fuel thickens into a gel that no engine will touch. Batteries drain in minutes. Even the specially formulated Arctic lubricants that engineers use in cold weather machinery begin to lose their effectiveness. The landscape is not merely cold. It is operating by a different set of rules than the world most humans inhabit. And yet the cold here is not uniform. It is not a flat, featureless wall of misery descending from the sky. Yakutia's extreme temperatures are in large part the product of a phenomenon called a temperature inversion, which is essentially the atmosphere behaving in the opposite of its usual manner. Normally, air cools as you ascend. You have felt this if you have ever climbed a hill and noticed the breeze getting sharper. But in the deep river valleys of inland Yakutia, dense, frigid air sinks and pools at the lowest elevations, unable to escape because the surrounding topography traps it like cold water filling a bowl. The valley floors become the coldest places on the planet, colder than the mountain peaks above them, colder than the open tundra, colder than nearly anywhere else on the surface of the earth. Oymyakon sits in precisely such a valley, nestled along the Indigirka River, and it is this geography, not some cosmic punishment, that makes it a record holder in human misery. You should know that Yakutia has a complicated relationship with its own reputation for cold. Locals will tell you, with a mixture of pride and mild exasperation, that the winters are cold but the summers are genuinely warm. This is not a comforting lie told to discourage emigration. It is meteorologically accurate and deeply strange. Because Yakutia is so far from any moderating oceanic influence, it experiences what climatologists call a continental climate taken to its logical extreme. Winter temperatures can sit at -50 degrees Celsius for weeks at a time. Summer temperatures in the same locations can climb to +35 degrees Celsius or even +38 degrees Celsius. The annual temperature range, the difference between the coldest and hottest recorded temperatures in a single location, can exceed 100 degrees Celsius in some parts of Yakutia, which is the largest such range of any populated place on Earth. The region does not merely experience seasons. It lurches between them with the dramatic commitment of a performer who has never heard of subtlety. The cold has its own calendar here, its own grammar, its own set of social obligations. There are degrees of cold that carry names and associated behaviors in Yakutian culture, not in the meteorological sense of named storms or official advisories, but in the practical folk wisdom sense, the kind of knowledge that accumulates across generations of people who have no choice but to pay attention. There is the cold that means you put on an extra layer. There is the cold that means you do not go out without covering your face entirely. There is the cold at which children are kept home from school, which, depending on the school and the region, typically begins around -52 degrees Celsius to -55 degrees Celsius, a threshold that feels almost quaint when you consider it as a bureaucratic designation for temperatures that would close every city in North America, Europe, and most of Asia instantly. And then there is the cold below that threshold, which carries its own quiet authority, the kind of cold that even the most experienced Yakutian residents speak about in a particular tone, not of fear exactly, but of respect, the way a sailor speaks about a particular stretch of ocean. Historians still argue whether the first humans to settle permanently in this region arrived during a period of slightly milder climate, or whether the ancestors of the modern Saka people possessed a cultural and biological resilience that simply has no equivalent elsewhere in human history. The question matters because it shapes how we understand the nature of the relationship between people and this place, whether it was a grudging adaptation to deteriorating conditions or a deliberate, confident choice to inhabit the extreme. Either way, the result is the same. A civilization, genuinely thriving in a place where the cold can kill an unprotected person in under 10 minutes. Here is a quirky detail that tends to delight people when they first hear it. At temperatures below about -45 degrees Celsius, if you throw a cup of boiling water into the air in Yakutia, it does not fall back down as water. It explodes instantly into a cloud of snow and steam, a phenomenon so visually dramatic that videos of it have circulated widely online, always attracting the same mix of wonder and disbelief from viewers in warmer climates. The physics behind it are straightforward. The water is atomized into tiny droplets by the throw, and those droplets have such a high surface area to volume ratio that they freeze almost instantaneously in the supercold air. But the visual effect is so counterintuitive, so gleefully defiant of expectation, that it never gets old. Locals have been doing this for fun, and for the benefit of curious visitors, for as long as anyone can remember. It is Yakutia's unofficial party trick, its calling card to the outside world, a tiny theatrical demonstration of just how differently the laws of nature operate here. The light, too, is part of the equation. In the depths of winter, Yakutsk receives only a few hours of pale, low-angled sunlight each day, and on the coldest days, which tend to cluster in January and early February, the sky often remains a flat, pewter gray that makes the distinction between day and night feel almost academic. The snow does not sparkle in winter sunlight the way it does in illustrated children's books. It sits there, blue-gray and dense, reflecting a sky the color of old pewter. But on clear nights, and there are plenty of them because the extreme cold tends to scrub moisture from the air and leave it crystalline and transparent, the stars are extraordinary. The Milky Way arches overhead with a clarity and density that would move even the most determinately unromantic person to stop and stare, breathing carefully through their scarf, watching their breath frost in the starlight. The cold, in these moments, becomes almost forgivable. Almost. You should also understand, before we go any further, that Yakutia is not simply an endurance test dressed up as a place to live. It is a region of genuine, sometimes jaw-dropping natural wealth. Beneath the permafrost, beneath the ice and the frozen silence and the record-breaking cold, lies roughly a quarter of the world's known diamond reserves. Yakutia also sits atop massive deposits of gold, coal, natural gas, and rare earth minerals. The ground is simultaneously one of the most hostile surfaces on Earth for human habitation and one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world in terms of what lies beneath it. There is a certain cosmic irony in this. The very cold that makes the surface nearly uninhabitable has, for millions of years, been perfectly preserving the geological wealth below. The permafrost is both the obstacle and the vault. And the wind. We will come back to the wind many times tonight, because in Yakutia the wind is never just weather. Even at temperatures of -50 degrees Celsius, a calm day is manageable with the right preparation. Uncomfortable, certainly, punishing, yes, but survivable with adequate clothing and shelter. Add a wind, even a moderate one, and the effective temperature on exposed skin plummets by another 20 or 30 degrees in terms of its felt impact. The wind strips away the thin layer of warm air that insulates the space immediately next to your skin, the microscopic thermal boundary layer that your body works constantly to maintain, and replaces it with fresh, lethal cold. The locals call this the wind that eats warmth, and they mean it literally. On windy days, the social calculus of Yakutian outdoor life shifts dramatically. Errands are delayed, animals are brought in, elderly people stay inside, and the walls of houses, those thick, insulated, triple-layered walls, shake faintly with the pressure of air that has crossed hundreds of kilometers of open tundra without encountering a single obstacle significant enough to slow it down. Tonight, you are inside those walls. You can hear the wind outside, a low, continuous vibration that is more felt than heard, a reminder that the world beyond the window is operating under conditions you were not quite designed for. But in here, there is warmth, and there is the soft amber light of a lamp, and there is the beginning of a story that has been accumulating for thousands of years in this place. Settle in. We are only just getting started. The walls of a Yakutian home are not merely a structural feature. They are a philosophical statement. When you press your palm against the interior wall of a traditional Yakutian house, a balagan, the old log dwelling that predates Soviet-era concrete by centuries, you can feel, if the cold outside is deep enough, a faint chill radiating inward through the logs even though a stove is burning on the other side of the room. The cold is not defeated by the walls. It is negotiated with. It presses in from every direction simultaneously, looking for gaps, testing the seals around windows, probing the joints between logs, finding the places where the insulation has compressed or shifted over years of freeze-thaw cycles. The house responds by working constantly. The fire in the stove is not a luxury or an ambience. It is a continuous metabolic necessity, the mechanical heart of a structure that is always, on some level, in a slow-motion contest with the temperature outside. This negotiation between shelter and cold has shaped Yakutian architecture in ways that are immediately visible and deeply practical. Traditional balcony were built low to the ground, with minimal window area, thick walls packed with earth and moss for insulation, and a single entrance that was typically preceded by a small enclosed vestibule, an airlock of sorts, a transitional space where the outside air could be partially warmed before it reached the living area. Every design choice was a direct response to the cold's specific strategies of infiltration. Windows were kept small not for lack of aesthetic appreciation for natural light, but because glass, even double-pane glass, which was a luxury for most of Yakutian history, is a thermal traitor, surrendering heat to the outside far faster than any well-constructed log wall. The vestibule entrance was not architectural whimsy. It was the difference between a door that let in a manageable puff of cold air and a door that sent a wave of -50 degrees Celsius atmosphere rolling across the floor to extinguish the fire and freeze the water bucket. You begin to understand, standing in this imagined space, that every feature of life in Yakutia carries this quality of being a direct, unromantic answer to a specific physical problem posed by the cold. There is very little that is decorative in the traditional Yakutian approach to survival, or rather, decoration and function have been so thoroughly fused over so many generations that it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The beautifully embroidered patterns on traditional Saka clothing are also, in their layering and construction, precisely engineered thermal systems. The communal gathering practices that characterize Saka social life are also, in their warmth and duration, a hedge against the psychological isolation that the long, dark winter imposes. Nothing is purely one thing. Everything is doing at least two jobs at once. Outside, the cold continues its patient work. In the very deepest winter, the kind of cold that settles in during late December and January when the sun barely clears the horizon for a few gray hours before retreating again. The landscape enters a state that is difficult to describe without resorting to the vocabulary of geology rather than meteorology. The ground is frozen to depths of several hundred meters. The rivers have sealed over with ice thick enough to serve as roads. And they do serve as roads, official winter roads maintained by regional authorities, with speed limits and weight restrictions posted on signs that stand at the river's edge with perfect bureaucratic seriousness. Trees in the boreal forest, the taiga that covers much of Yakutia's vast interior, crack and boom in the cold, a sound locals call the singing of the forest, caused by the contraction of wood fibers at temperatures far below what temperate zone trees ever experience. If you are out in the taiga on a still minus 60 degrees Celsius night, the trees around you are cracking rhythmically, a slow, deep percussion that carries across enormous distances in the dense, cold air, and the sound is genuinely eerie. The forest talking to itself in a language made of ice and stress fractures. There is a mainstream historical fact worth pausing on here. The coldest reliably recorded air temperature in the northern hemisphere, outside of polar ice sheets, was recorded in this region, specifically near Oymyakon, at approximately minus 67.7 degrees Celsius in 1933, though some sources reference measurements as low as minus 71.2 degrees Celsius from earlier in the 20th century. The exact figure is, appropriately, still debated, because the instruments available in the early Soviet period were not always calibrated to the standards of modern meteorology, and because the conditions that produce such extreme readings are themselves rare enough that verification is inherently difficult. But the broad truth, that this region experiences the coldest temperatures of any permanently inhabited place on Earth, is not in serious dispute. Oymyakon and the surrounding areas of inland Yakutia hold a record that no other community of humans has come close to matching, and they have held it for as long as systematic temperature records have been kept. What the numbers cannot quite capture is the texture of the cold, the way it integrates into daily life not as an emergency or an anomaly but as the fundamental condition against which everything else is measured. You are warm right now wherever you are reading this, perhaps tucked under a duvet, perhaps with a mug of something hot cooling gently on the nightstand, perhaps with the heating system of your home running quietly in the background, a piece of technology so normalized that you almost never think about it. In Yakutia, warmth is never that casual. Warmth is always earned, always attended to, always the product of specific intentional actions. The wood that was cut and stacked in autumn, the fire that was lit at a particular time, the clothing that was put on in the correct sequence before stepping outside, the decision about whether the errand is necessary enough to justify the exposure. Warmth in Yakutia is a project, and the cold is the reason the project never ends. The wind shakes the walls again, a low moan that passes through the structure and fades. Outside, the temperature is somewhere below minus 50 degrees Celsius and the stars are extraordinary. Inside, the stove is burning, and the story is just beginning to warm up. The ground beneath Yakutsk is lying to you. It looks solid. It looks like the kind of foundation you could build a civilization on, and technically people have, but press your hand into it in summer and dig down far enough, and you will find that the earth here has never, not once in recorded human history, fully thawed. The permafrost beneath Yakutsk extends downward for an almost incomprehensible distance. In some areas, the frozen ground reaches depths of over 1,500 meters. That is nearly a mile of continuously frozen earth, layer upon layer of soil and rock and ancient organic material that has been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years, in some cases for millions. You are not standing on ground so much as you are standing on a very large, very old freezer that has temporarily agreed to support your weight. This is the foundational paradox of Yakutsk, the largest city in the world built entirely on continuous permafrost. With a population of around 350,000 people, it is not a frontier outpost or a research station or a temporary industrial settlement. It is a functioning city with universities, shopping centers, restaurants, a thriving art scene, traffic jams, and all the bureaucratic and social machinery that the word city implies. And every single structure in it has to contend, in one way or another, with the fact that the ground beneath it is frozen solid but desperately wants to misbehave the moment warmth is introduced. The core engineering problem of building on permafrost is deceptively simple to state and genuinely nightmarish to solve. If you build a heated structure directly on frozen ground, the way you would build almost anywhere else in the world, with a foundation that transfers the building's weight into the earth below. The heat from the building gradually warms the ground beneath it. And when permafrost warms, it does not simply become cold ground. The ice within it melts, and the soil, which was rigid and load-bearing when frozen, becomes soft, waterlogged, and structurally useless. The building begins to sink unevenly because the thaw does not progress at a uniform rate. One corner sinks faster than another. The foundation tilts, walls crack, doors stop opening, pipes shear, and eventually, if nothing is done, the building becomes a tilted, crumbling ruin sinking slowly into a bog of its own making, which is arguably not a great outcome for a hospital or an apartment block. The Soviets, who were responsible for most of the large-scale construction in Yakutsk during the 20th century, discovered this problem with the empirical enthusiasm of people who had not fully thought things through before beginning. Early Soviet-era buildings in Yakutsk were constructed using conventional methods adapted from other parts of Russia, and the results were instructive in the manner that catastrophic failures tend to be instructive. Buildings sank, foundations cracked, entire structures had to be abandoned. The permafrost, it turned out, did not care about 5-year plans or production quotas or the theoretical elegance of centralized infrastructure. It operated on its own schedule and by its own rules, and those rules were non-negotiable. The solution that engineers eventually arrived at, after considerable trial and expensive error, was to stop fighting the permafrost and start working with it. The key insight, obvious in retrospect as key insights tend to be, was that permafrost is actually an excellent building material as long as you keep it cold. Frozen ground is rigid, stable, and capable of bearing enormous loads. The problem is not the permafrost itself. The problem is introducing heat into it. So the answer is to build in a way that preserves the frozen state of the ground beneath the structure, even while the structure itself is kept warm for human habitation. The result is the defining visual feature of modern Yakutsk: buildings raised on stilts. When you walk through Yakutsk for the first time, or imagine doing so tonight, which is perhaps the more comfortable option, the stilts are everywhere. Apartment blocks, office buildings, schools, government facilities. They all stand elevated above the ground on concrete or metal columns, typically 1 to 2 meters in the air, leaving a gap between the building's underfloor and the earth below. This gap is ventilated, open to the outside air, even in winter, so that the cold outside air circulates freely beneath the building, keeping the ground frozen even as the heated interior above radiates warmth downward. The building sits on the permafrost the way a careful hiker sits on a frozen lake, distributing its weight, minimizing its thermal footprint, keeping the fundamental relationship between itself and the cold ground it depends on intact. Walking beneath these elevated buildings in winter, you are in a strange architectural interstitial space. Not outside exactly, since the building above creates a kind of roof, but not sheltered either, since the wind moves freely through. The concrete stilts are often heavily frosted, elaborately ornamented with ice that has accumulated from moisture in the air, and the ground below the building is hard-packed snow and frozen earth, darker and drier than the open ground nearby because the building above shields it from direct snowfall. Pipes run along the undersides of buildings here rather than buried in the ground, because burying pipes in permafrost is an engineering adventure that historically ends with the pipes shearing when the ground shifts. You can see the infrastructure of the city quite literally from the street. The water mains, the heating pipes, the cable conduits, all wrapped in insulation and running above ground along elevated supports, tracing the arteries of urban life in plain sight against the gray winter sky. Historians still argue whether the decision to expand Yakutsk into a major Soviet administrative and industrial center was a rational economic choice given the extraordinary engineering costs involved, or whether it was driven more by ideological considerations, the Soviet desire to demonstrate that socialism could conquer even the most hostile environments, that human will and collective organization could prevail over any natural obstacle. The practical costs of maintaining a city of this size in these conditions are staggering. Heating bills alone are a significant fraction of the regional economy. The ongoing work of monitoring and maintaining the permafrost beneath buildings, a field called geocryology that is taken extremely seriously in Yakutia, requires a permanent scientific establishment and continuous investment. Every time a building's thermal management system fails, even briefly, the consequences can be serious and expensive. The permafrost is not forgiving of lapses in attention. And it is changing. This is the part that keeps Yakutian engineers and geocryologists awake at night in a way that has nothing to do with the cold outside. Climate change is warming the Arctic at roughly 2 to 4 times the global average rate, and the permafrost that underlies Yakutsk and the broader Yakutian region is responding. Not dramatically, not yet. The permafrost here is so deep and so cold that it will take a very long time for surface warming to penetrate to significant depths. But the upper layers are shifting. The active layer, the top portion of the ground that thaws and refreezes with the seasons, is getting deeper each year in many locations, meaning that foundations designed for a certain depth of stable permafrost are finding that stable boundary creeping downward. Buildings that were engineered with comfortable margins in the 20th century are being reassessed. Some are already showing signs of instability. The city that was built to work with the permafrost now has to contend with the possibility that the permafrost itself is an unreliable partner. There is a quirky and somewhat melancholy tidbit that illustrates this transition vividly. Across Yakutia, the increasing instability of permafrost has caused a phenomenon that locals and scientists both call drunken forests. Stands of trees in the taiga and on the outskirts of settlements that lean at wild, chaotic angles because the ground beneath them has partially thawed and subsided unevenly, tilting the root systems and sending the trunks listing in all directions like partygoers at the end of a long evening. The effect is visually surreal, a forest that appears to have lost its structural confidence. And it is spreading. What was once an occasional curiosity is becoming a common sight across the Siberian north. A slow-motion landscape-level demonstration of what happens when the frozen foundation of a world begins to soften. But for now, tonight, the permafrost beneath Yakutsk is holding. The stilted buildings stand in their rows, elevated above the frozen ground. Their heated interiors and ventilated undersides maintaining the thermal truce that makes urban life here possible. The heating pipes that run above ground are wrapped in their orange and silver insulation like enormous caterpillars threading through the city, and they are warm to the touch even when the air temperature outside is minus 50 degrees Celsius, because the district heating system, a Soviet-era infrastructure of centralized boilers and insulated pipes that delivers heat to entire neighborhoods from a single source, is one of the genuine engineering triumphs of the Yakutsk story. When it works magnificently. When it fails, which happens occasionally because no system is perfect, the city mobilizes with practiced urgency, because a heating failure at minus 50 degrees Celsius is not an inconvenience. It is a clock counting down. The city was founded in 1632, though its early incarnation was nothing like what stands today. Russian Cossack explorers, expanding eastward with the relentless, often brutal momentum of the Tsarist frontier, established an ostrog, a fortified outpost, on the banks of the Lena River. The site they chose was practical from the perspective of river navigation and fur trade logistics, but it was not chosen with any particular appreciation for the geological conditions underfoot. The early settlers built in the Russian frontier style, and the permafrost ate several of their structures before the lesson was sufficiently absorbed. The town shifted locations at least once in its early history as the bank of the Lena shifted and the ground proved less cooperative than desired. What eventually grew from that initial outpost into the current city of Yakutsk is a story of continuous, expensive, grudging negotiation with a landscape that was never consulted about whether it wanted a city built on top of it. The Lena River itself deserves a moment of attention here, because it is one of the great rivers of the world and the central geographical fact of Yakutsk's existence. The Lena is approximately 4,400 kilometers long, making it one of the 10 longest rivers on Earth, and for most of the year it is frozen. The ice on the Lena can reach thicknesses of over 2 meters in winter, and during the coldest months it serves as a major transport route. Trucks and cars drive on it. Seasonal ice roads connecting communities that have no other land access. But the spring breakup of the Lena ice is one of the most dramatic annual events in Yakutia. Enormous slabs of ice, some the size of houses, are thrust upward and sideways by the pressure of water moving beneath them, grinding against each other with a grinding, roaring sound that can be heard kilometers away. The breakup can cause flooding, can damage riverbank structures, and marks the transition from winter to the brief, intense Yakutian summer with the subtlety of a demolition crew. Tonight, though, the Lena is frozen and silent. The city on its bank is lit against the dark sky, its elevated buildings standing over their ventilated gaps, its heating pipes threading warmth through the Arctic air, its population of 350,000 people going about their evening routines with the matter-of-fact composure of people who have made their peace with building a life on frozen ground. The permafrost holds. For now, it holds. You did not end up here by accident. That is the first thing to understand about the Saka people, the indigenous inhabitants of this vast frozen republic whose ancestors did not stumble into Yakutia by misfortune or miscalculation but arrived here through a process that was, by any reasonable interpretation, an act of deliberate and extraordinary human ambition. The Saka are a Turkic people, and their origins lie far to the south and west of their current homeland, in the region around Lake Baikal and the southern Siberian steppes, where the climate, while hardly tropical, was a great deal more forgiving than the Lena River basin in January. Sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries, likely in connection with the disruptions caused by Mongol expansion across Central Asia, the ancestors of the Saka people began a northward migration that would eventually carry them into one of the most extreme environments on the planet. This migration was not a panicked flight. It was a slow, generational movement of a pastoral people who brought with them the animals and the knowledge and the cultural practices that had sustained them in their southern homeland, and who adapted those practices, incrementally and ingeniously, to conditions of increasing severity as they moved north. The horses and cattle that the Saka brought with them, and the Saka are unusual among the indigenous peoples of the far north in their traditional reliance on horses and cattle rather than reindeer, had to be adapted over generations to the new climate, producing the distinctive Yakutian horse and Yakutian cattle, breeds that are biologically remarkable for their cold tolerance and that represent centuries of selective pressure applied by people who needed their animals to survive the same winters they were surviving. The Yakutian horse, in particular, is a compact, heavily built animal with an extraordinarily thick winter coat that can maintain its body temperature at -60 degrees Celsius without supplemental shelter, a feat of biological engineering that no other domestic horse breed approaches. The question of precisely when and why the Saka moved north is one of those historical puzzles that generates genuinely interesting academic disagreement. Historians still argue whether the northward migration was primarily driven by pressure from other groups displacing the Proto-Saka from their southern territories, or whether it was a more opportunistic expansion into a thinly populated ecological niche that offered certain strategic advantages: abundant land, rich river fisheries, relative isolation from the political turbulence of the Eurasian steppe. The oral traditions of the Saka themselves emphasize the agency and courage of their ancestors rather than flight or desperation, and there is no particular reason to privilege the external academic framing over the internal cultural memory. What is not in dispute is the outcome. A Turkic pastoral people took up residence in the coldest inhabited region on Earth and did not merely survive there but built a sophisticated, flourishing culture that has now persisted for the better part of a millennium. The cultural achievement this represents is difficult to overstate. The Saka arrived in Yakutia with a set of practices and knowledge systems calibrated for a different environment and had to undertake a wholesale reimagination of how to live. Not over a few years of emergency adaptation, but over generations of careful observation, experimentation, and cultural transmission. They learned which plants in the taiga had medicinal properties and which were toxic. They learned the behavior of the rivers across the seasons, which stretches of ice were safe for travel and which were undermined by currents and unreliable. They learned the patterns of the weather, not in the abstract meteorological sense, but in the intimate, granular, life-or-death sense of reading the specific signs that preceded the most dangerous conditions. They learned to read the wind. The wind in Yakutia is not merely a climatic variable. For the Saka, it has always been a source of information, a carrier of meaning, a voice in the ongoing conversation between the human world and the natural one. We will return to this relationship in much more depth when we reach the folklore and spiritual traditions of the Saka, but it is worth noting here, in the context of the people's origins and adaptations, that the Saka relationship with the natural world is fundamentally dialogic. It is based on the idea of mutual communication and obligation rather than one-way exploitation or passive endurance. The land is not simply a resource or a challenge. It is a partner, and like any partner, it has moods and expectations and things it requires of you in return for what it provides. This philosophy is embedded in the Saka spiritual tradition of Tengrism, a complex animistic belief system that the Saka shared in various forms with many of the peoples of the Eurasian steppe and which, in its Yakutian iteration, took on characteristics shaped directly by the specific nature of the northern environment. In Saka Tengrism, the world is organized vertically with an upper world of benevolent sky spirits, a middle world of human and natural beings, and a lower world associated with cold, darkness, and the forces that work against human life and flourishing. The cold itself, and specifically the spirit of cold, Chiskin, the Lord of Cold, sometimes called the Master of the Polar Frost, occupies a significant place in Saka cosmology, not as a purely malevolent force but as a powerful one that must be understood, respected, and properly addressed through ritual and right behavior. Chiskin is typically depicted as an elderly man with a long white beard, traveling in the coldest depths of winter, and his relationship with humanity is one of demanding but not unreasonable authority. He will let you live if you conduct yourself properly. He will not be fooled, and he will not be mocked. The figure of the shaman, the Alganur in Saka tradition, was historically the primary mediator between the human community and the spirit world, including the formidable spirits of the cold and the wind. Saka shamanic practice was elaborate, involving specific costumes, musical instruments, ritual protocols, and an extended period of training and initiation that was understood to involve genuine spiritual transformation rather than simply the acquisition of a body of knowledge. A shaman who had been properly initiated was believed to be capable of traveling between the layers of the world, communicating with spirits, diagnosing the spiritual causes of illness or misfortune, and intervening on behalf of the community in negotiations with the forces that controlled weather, game, and the other conditions on which survival depended. The shaman was, in practical terms, one of the most important people in a Saka community, not merely a religious functionary but a combination of doctor, meteorologist, diplomat, and crisis manager. The Soviet period brought systematic and often violent suppression of Saka shamanic practice, as it did with indigenous religious traditions across the USSR. Shamans were arrested, their ritual objects confiscated and destroyed, their practices criminalized. The disruption to Saka cultural life was profound and in some respects irreversible. Yet the tradition was not entirely extinguished. It survived in fragmentary, partially concealed forms through the Soviet decades, preserved in family memories, in the oral literature of Saka epic poetry, the Elanco, and in the quiet continuation of practices that could be plausibly presented as folk custom rather than religious observance. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a significant Saka cultural revival that included renewed interest in shamanic practice, and today there are practitioners who identify as shamans and who perform ceremonies for communities across Yakutia. Whether these contemporary practitioners represent genuine continuity with the pre-Soviet tradition or a reconstruction from historical records and surviving fragments is a question that inspires strong and differing opinions within the Saka community itself. The Elanco, the Saka heroic epic tradition, deserves particular mention because it is one of the great oral literary traditions of the world and was recognized as such when UNESCO designated it an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2005. Elanco epics are long, sometimes extraordinarily long. A full performance can last for several nights, and they tell the stories of heroic ancestors navigating a world populated by spirits, supernatural creatures, and the demands of an unforgiving environment. The performance of Elanco is itself a skilled art, involving a combination of recitation, chanting, and vocal techniques that produce sounds representing different characters and spirits, including the specific vocal register associated with the cold spirits of the lower world. A skilled Elanco-sut, an Elanco performer, was a person of significant cultural prestige, and the epics they performed served as a kind of cultural encyclopedia, embedding within their narrative structures the geography, the ethics, the cosmology, and the practical survival knowledge of Saka civilization. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that a people living in the coldest inhabited place on Earth developed one of the world's great oral literary traditions. The long winter nights, and in Yakutia the winter nights are very long indeed, were not empty time to be endured but cultural time to be filled. The gathering of community members around a fire to hear an Elanco performance was simultaneously entertainment, education, spiritual practice, and social cohesion, a multifunctional cultural technology perfectly suited to the conditions of the long dark. The cold outside, the fire inside, the voice of the Elanco-sut filling the warm air with the deeds of heroes who had faced the cold and the dark and the spirits of the lower world and prevailed. This was how a culture reproduced itself across the generations, how it kept faith with its own identity, how it made the winter not just survivable but meaningful. The Saka population today numbers approximately 500,000 people, with the majority living in the Saka Republic. They are a people with a strong and actively maintained cultural identity, the Saka language, which belongs to the Siberian branch of the Turkic language family, is spoken by the vast majority of ethnic Saka and is an official language of the Republic alongside Russian. Yakutsk has Saka language media, schools offering instruction in Saka, cultural institutions dedicated to preserving and developing Saka arts and traditions, and a political establishment that is predominantly ethnically Saka in a way that reflects the particular status of the Republic within the Russian Federation. The relationship between Saka cultural identity and the specific character of the Yakutian landscape is not incidental. It is foundational. The Saka are not merely a people who happen to live in a cold place. They are a people whose identity, cosmology, language, art, and practical knowledge are all, at their deepest levels, shaped by and responsive to the specific conditions of this extraordinary environment. The cold made them, not in the sense of a passive, deterministic shaping, as though the climate simply imposed a particular form on a passive human material, but in the sense that the ongoing generational negotiation with these conditions, the observation, the adaptation, the cultural elaboration of what it means to live here, produced a people and a culture that are genuinely unique. You cannot fully understand the Saka without understanding the cold. And after tonight, you may find that you understand the cold a little better for having met the people who chose it. Outside, the wind moves through the taiga. The trees crack and murmur. And in the warm interior of a Yakutsk apartment, somewhere, someone is telling a story. You are getting dressed. This is not a casual or meditative activity in Yakutia. It is not the half-awake, grab whatever is on the chair process that passes for getting dressed in most of the world. In Yakutia, getting dressed for the outdoors in winter is a structured, sequential, almost ceremonial procedure that, if performed incorrectly, can get you killed. Not metaphorically killed, not inconvenienced, not mildly frostbitten on the fingertips in a way that makes for a good story later. Actually, clinically, permanently killed by exposure in a time frame that would shock most people who have never had to think seriously about cold as a mortal threat. At -50 degrees Celsius with any wind at all, exposed skin begins sustaining frostbite damage within minutes. At -60 degrees Celsius on a calm day, the margin for error is measured in single-digit minutes. Getting dressed, therefore, is not something you rush, and it is not something you improvise. The foundational principle of cold weather dressing, and this applies whether you are a Saka elder drawing on centuries of accumulated tradition or a modern Yakutsk resident consulting a survival guide, is layering, but not layering in the casual, fashionable sense that outdoor clothing brands use the word in their marketing materials. Layering in the Yakutian sense is a precisely calibrated system in which each layer performs a specific function and in which the failure of any single layer compromises the entire system. The innermost layer manages moisture. Your body sweats even in extreme cold, and wet fabric against skin is one of the fastest ways to lose heat, because water conducts thermal energy away from the body many times faster than air. The middle layers provide insulation. They trap air warmed by your body and hold it close, creating a thermal buffer between you and the outside temperature. The outer layer is a wind and moisture barrier. It prevents that insulating air from being stripped away by wind and keeps precipitation from penetrating to the layers beneath. Traditional Saka clothing understood all of this with complete functional clarity long before the language of thermal management existed to describe it. The innermost garment worn in traditional Saka dress was typically made from the softest available material, the hide of young animals, processed to exceptional softness, or in some cases woven fabric for communities that had access to trade goods. The critical property of this layer was its texture against skin. Rough or scratchy material causes the wearer to shift and fidget, which disrupts the insulating air pockets in the outer layers and accelerates heat loss. Comfort, in this context, is not a luxury but a thermal efficiency requirement. Your grandmother was right that you should wear something soft next to your skin, though she may not have framed it as a matter of survival thermodynamics. The middle insulating layers in traditional Saka dress were typically made from fur, specifically from the furs of animals whose own biology had solved the problem of staying warm in Yakutian winters, which is as sensible an approach to the problem as any. Reindeer hide, worn with the fur facing inward against the body, is the gold standard of Yakutian insulation, for reasons that are visible under a microscope. Reindeer fur consists of hollow fibers, each individual hair a tiny sealed tube of air, which gives it an insulating capacity per unit of weight that no synthetic material produced before the late 20th century could match. The air trapped inside each fiber is the insulation. The fur itself is simply the architecture that holds that air in place. A well-made reindeer fur garment is warm in a way that feels almost improbable for its weight, a softness and lightness that belies its thermal performance, and the Saka recognized and exploited this property with impressive sophistication. The outer layer in the traditional Saka system was typically a long coat, the Saka call it a san, cut to a length that covered the body from neck to mid-calf or below, with a high collar that could be raised to protect the lower face, and designed to overlap at the front rather than button or fasten with hardware, because metal buttons and clasps at -50 degrees Celsius become instruments of frostbite whenever bare skin contacts them. The san was typically made from the toughest available hide on the outside, often horsehide or the skin of mature reindeer, with the fur facing inward for insulation and the smooth, wind-resistant leather exterior facing out. The cut of a traditional san was not merely practical but beautiful. The Saka aesthetic sensibility applied itself to the outer garment with considerable energy, and traditional san designs feature elaborate embroidered trim, geometric patterns in contrasting colors, and decorative elements at the collar, cuffs, and hem that mark both the maker's skill and the wearer's social identity. Hands and feet demand their own extended discussion, because in extreme cold the extremities are where the body's thermoregulation system makes its most ruthless calculations. The body's priority in cold conditions is to maintain the temperature of the core, the vital organs, and it will sacrifice the extremities to do so, constricting blood flow to the hands and feet in order to keep the heart and lungs and brain warm. This is physiologically sensible and individually catastrophic if the hands and feet are not independently protected, because the reduced blood flow means reduced metabolic heat generation in the extremities, which means they cool faster than the core, which means frostbite sets in even when the core remains warm. The traditional Saka solution for the hands was a multi-layer system of inner gloves, thin, close-fitting, made from the softest skin available, topped by large outer mittens of heavy fur, worn loose enough to allow the hand to curl inside and warm the fingertips against the palm if they began to cool. The mitten rather than the glove is the correct outer hand covering for serious cold, because it keeps the fingers together where they can share heat, rather than isolating each finger in its own compartment where it must fend for itself. The boots, the Saka Torbesa, are a masterpiece of functional design that took generations to perfect and that modern materials science has only partially managed to equal. Traditional Torbesa were constructed from multiple materials selected for their specific properties in different parts of the boot. The sole was typically made from the skin of the legs of a reindeer or horse leg skin, which is thicker and tougher than body skin and has a natural texture that provides grip on ice and packed snow. The upper was made from softer body hide, cut and sewn to fit the foot and lower leg closely without tight spots that would restrict circulation, because restricted circulation in cold conditions is not a minor inconvenience but a direct pathway to frostbite. The interior of the boot was lined with fur, and inside the boot, before putting it on, you would stuff a layer of dried sedge grass, a material whose insulating properties were known to Yakutian peoples long before any synthetic alternative existed, and which has the additional useful property of absorbing moisture, keeping the interior of the boot dry over the course of a long day in the cold. There is a quirky and somewhat charming detail about Yakutian footwear that reveals the depth of cultural knowledge embedded in what might otherwise seem like a simple craft tradition. The sewing of cold-weather boots and garments was traditionally done using thread made from the sinew of the very animals whose hides were being sewn, and this was not merely a matter of using available materials. Sinew thread has a specific and useful property that no plant fiber or early synthetic thread can match. It swells slightly when wet, which means that the seams of a garment sewn with sinew thread become tighter and more watertight when exposed to moisture, rather than loosening as many other threads do. A garment whose seams self-seal in wet conditions is a garment whose thermal performance improves precisely when it is most challenged. The Saka seamstresses who perfected this technique were not working from an understanding of material science in the academic sense, but they had arrived at functionally identical conclusions through careful observation over many generations, and the result was a cold-weather garment system whose sophistication any modern outdoor equipment designer would respect. The making of cold-weather clothing was traditionally women's work in Saka culture, and it was prestigious, skilled work, not in the condescending sense of being praised for domestic labor, but in the genuine sense that a woman known for the quality of her sewing was a person of recognized social status whose skills were understood to have direct life and death implications for her family and community. The knowledge of how to select the right hides, how to process them correctly, how to cut and sew them to produce a garment that would actually keep a person alive at minus 60 degrees Celsius was not trivial knowledge. It was the product of years of apprenticeship and practice, transmitted from mother to daughter across generations, embedded in a set of techniques and standards that were maintained with the seriousness that any life-critical knowledge demands. Historians still argue whether the gendered division of labor in traditional Saka society reflected a hierarchical valuation of different types of work or a more egalitarian recognition that different kinds of essential knowledge required specialization. And it is, as these debates tend to be, probably more complicated than either simple answer suggests. The head is where you lose the most heat, and this is physiologically straightforward. The brain is the organ the body is most reluctant to let cool, and so it maintains relatively robust blood flow to the head even when it is restricting flow to the extremities, which means the head is continuously losing heat to the environment at a rate that reflects the full temperature differential between your body and the outside air. A hat is not optional in Yakutian winter. It is not a fashion accessory or a hedge against mild chill. It is a structural component of your survival system. Traditional Saka headwear ranged from simple fur caps to elaborate constructions that covered the head, ears, neck, and framed the face, leaving only the eyes, nose, and mouth exposed, the minimum facial exposure necessary to see where you are going and breathe. The face coverings that protected the nose and lower face in the coldest conditions were sometimes made from the fur of animals with particularly soft, dense pelts, positioned so that the breath could pass through or around them without immediately icing up, which is a genuine engineering challenge that anyone who has worn a balaclava in serious cold will appreciate. Modern Yakutians dress in layers that blend traditional knowledge with contemporary materials, technical synthetic base layers that wick moisture more efficiently than any natural fiber, high-loft synthetic or down insulating mid-layers, outer shells made from modern windproof and water-resistant fabrics. The Torbesa have largely been replaced by modern insulated boots for everyday wear, though traditional footwear is still made and worn for ceremonial occasions and by people who have learned its properties firsthand and trust it over synthetic alternatives. The fundamental architecture of the system, moisture management, insulation, wind protection, special attention to extremities and head, is the same as it has always been, because the cold has not changed its requirements. Only the materials have been updated. There is one more element of cold weather dressing in Yakutia that deserves mention, and it is less about the clothing itself than about the ritual of putting it on and taking it off. In extremely cold conditions, the transition between inside and outside, the moment of exposure, is one of the highest risk moments of the day. Coming in from minus 55 degrees Celsius to a heated interior, if done without proper care, can cause the glasses of a spectacle wearer to instantly fog and then freeze, leaving them temporarily blind in a dangerous environment. More seriously, clothing that has been outside and is covered with ice crystals, brought into a warm interior, will melt those crystals, leaving the garment damp, and a damp garment put back on for the next trip outside is a garment that will perform significantly worse than a dry one. The management of clothing moisture, drying garments properly between outings, storing them in ways that prevent ice formation, knowing when a garment is too compromised by moisture to be safely worn, is a body of practical knowledge that is so deeply embedded in Yakutian daily life that most people who have grown up here perform it automatically, without conscious thought, the way a person in a temperate climate automatically looks both ways before crossing a street. You are dressed now. Every layer is in place, every fastening secured, every gap covered. You check the seal at your collar, the coverage of your hat over your ears, the fit of your outer mittens over your glove liners. You take a breath, a careful breath, through your nose rather than your mouth, so that the air is at least partially warmed before it reaches your lungs. And then you open the door. The cold burns calories at a rate that would alarm a nutritionist from almost anywhere else in the world. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. It is straightforward thermodynamics applied to the biological furnace of the human body, which must work significantly harder to maintain its core temperature of 37 degrees Celsius when the outside air is sitting at minus 50 degrees Celsius than when it is sitting at a comfortable minus 5 degrees Celsius or a mild 15 degrees Celsius. The thermal gradient between your body and the environment is the engine of heat loss, and the steeper that gradient, the faster the engine runs, and the more fuel it requires to keep pace. A person doing moderate outdoor work in deep Yakutian winter, chopping wood, tending animals, traveling by foot or snowmobile across the taiga, can burn somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day, which is roughly twice what a moderately active person in a temperate climate requires. The body is not being greedy. It is simply paying its heating bill. This caloric demand has shaped the diet of Yakutia in ways that are immediately striking to anyone accustomed to the nutritional conventions of warmer climates. The Yakutian diet is, by the standards of most contemporary dietary guidance, aggressively high in fat and protein and relatively low in the plant-based foods that form the foundation of most modern healthy eating recommendations. This is not a cultural oversight or a historical accident of limited options. It is a precise and finely tuned nutritional response to the specific demands of living in extreme cold. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient available, providing 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories per gram for both protein and carbohydrate, and it is also a metabolic substrate that the body can use with particular efficiency for thermogenesis, the generation of heat. A diet high in fat is, in the context of extreme cold survival, not a health risk but a physiological necessity, and traditional Yakutian foodways reflect this with complete unself-consciousness. The centerpiece of traditional Yakutian cold-weather diet is meat, specifically horse meat and the meat of Yakutian cattle, supplemented by fish from the rivers and lakes, wild game from the taiga, and in coastal and riverine communities, the meat of waterfowl during the brief summer season. Horse meat is particularly valued in Yakutian diet for reasons that go beyond simple availability. The fat of the Yakutian horse has a specific composition, high in unsaturated fatty acids, that remains liquid and easily metabolizable even at low temperatures, and that provides a sustained, slow-burning energy source ideal for maintaining body temperature over long periods of cold exposure. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of the same long coevolutionary relationship between the Saka people and their horses that produced the remarkable cold tolerance of the Yakutian horse breed itself. The animals and the people adapted to the environment together, and the nutritional properties of the animal's tissues are part of that adaptation. One of the most distinctive and frequently remarked upon elements of Yakutian food culture is the practice of eating meat and fish raw and frozen, a preparation method that sounds alarming to outside observers, but that is deeply practical and nutritionally sophisticated when understood in context. The dish called stroganina is the most famous example. Thin shavings of frozen raw fish or meat, typically horse or reindeer, cut with a sharp knife from a frozen carcass and eaten immediately, sometimes dipped in salt or a simple seasoning. The fish most commonly used for stroganina include whitefish, muksun, and nelma, cold water species from the Lena River system whose flesh is rich in fat and whose flavor, when fresh frozen, is clean and mild rather than the fishy intensity that poorly handled fish from warmer climates can develop. The freezing process essentially replaces conventional cooking in several important respects. It destroys many pathogens, it changes the texture of the flesh in ways that make it palatable and easy to eat in thin slices, and it preserves the nutritional integrity of the food with a completeness that heat-based cooking cannot always match. If you have never eaten stroganina, the experience is described by those who have as surprisingly delicate. The frozen shavings melt on the tongue, releasing a clean, cold, faintly rich flavor that bears almost no resemblance to the cooked fish of other culinary traditions. There is a specific pleasure in it that seems to be associated with the contrast between the cold food and the warm interior of the mouth, a sensory experience that is genuinely its own thing rather than a second-best substitute for something more conventional. Yakutians who have moved to warmer parts of Russia or the world frequently report that stroganina is the food they miss most acutely, not merely as a nostalgic comfort, but as a specific sensory experience that no other food replicates. You can take the person out of Yakutia, it turns out, but the taste memory of frozen raw fish on a cold morning is remarkably persistent. The preparation and consumption of stroganina carries its own social and ceremonial weight in Yakutian culture. Cutting stroganina is a skilled activity. The shavings should be thin, uniform, and elegantly curled, a demonstration of knife skill and practice that is noted and appreciated. Sharing stroganina is a gesture of hospitality and warmth, which is pleasingly paradoxical given the temperature of the food. At gatherings and celebrations, the arrival of a board of fresh stroganina is received with the enthusiasm that a charcuterie board or a freshly baked loaf might receive in other food cultures. It is a centerpiece, a conversation piece, a sign that the host has taken care. The social life of food in Yakutia is as rich and layered as in any other culture, especially when, the food itself is frozen solid. Beyond stroganina, The Yakutia food tradition encompasses a range of fermented and preserved foods that reflect the practical necessity of storing nutrition through the long winter when fresh food is unavailable. Fermented mare's milk, kumis, is a beverage shared across many Turkic cultures and is consumed in Yakutia as both a refreshment and a food with significant caloric and probiotic value. Fermented fish, prepared through a process of controlled decomposition that produces an intensely flavored product called yukala when dried, or a more pungent fermented variety in some traditions, provides protein and fat in a shelf-stable form that can sustain a family through periods when the rivers are frozen too deeply for fishing and hunting has been unproductive. These fermented foods are an acquired taste in the most literal sense. They are flavors that people grow up with and that are deeply embedded in the sensory landscape of Yakutian childhood, and that can seem challenging to the uninitiated, but they represent a nutritional technology of genuine sophistication, the product of generations of experimentation with preservation methods in an environment where food security is never guaranteed. The liver, kidneys, brain, and bone marrow of hunted and slaughtered animals are consumed in traditional Yakutian diet with a thoroughness that reflects both the nutritional wisdom of using every available calorie and a cultural ethic of respect toward the animals that provide food. Bone marrow, in particular, is nutritionally extraordinary, dense with fat, fat-soluble vitamins, and easily metabolizable calories. And the marrow bones of horses and cattle were traditionally cracked and the marrow scooped out and eaten raw or very lightly warmed, a practice that delivers a concentrated hit of exactly the kind of calories the body needs to maintain its temperature in deep cold. The fat around the kidneys of horse and cattle, suet-equivalent fat deposits that are particularly rich in saturated and monounsaturated fatty acids, was rendered and stored and used as both a cooking fat and a direct food, eaten with bread or mixed into other preparations as a caloric supplement. There is a mainstream historical fact embedded in Yakutian food history that deserves specific attention. The Yakutian permafrost has served as a natural deep freeze for organic material for tens of thousands of years, and the people of the region have long known about the frozen remains of animals in the permafrost, including, most dramatically, woolly mammoths, which have been found preserved with extraordinary completeness across Yakutia, their flesh, hair, and internal organs intact after tens of thousands of years of frozen storage. There are documented historical accounts, and some contemporary reports, of people and animals consuming the flesh of permafrost-preserved ancient animals, including mammoths and extinct species of horse and bison. The practice is not common, and the safety of consuming such ancient material is questionable for reasons that go beyond the obvious, but the fact that permafrost preservation is thorough enough that ancient flesh remains physically recognizable, and in some cases edible, after geological timescales is a striking illustration of just how effective the Yakutian deep freeze actually is. The modern Yakutian diet blends traditional practices with the full range of contemporary food options available through the supply chains that connect even this remote region to global food systems. Supermarkets in Yakutsk stock imported fruit and vegetables at prices that reflect the cost of transporting fresh produce to one of the most logistically challenging markets on the planet, which means that a cucumber in Yakutsk can cost several times what it costs in Moscow. The logistics of food supply to Yakutia are a significant regional challenge. For much of the year, the primary route for heavy goods into the region is the winter road system that uses frozen rivers and specially prepared ice roads across the tundra. And during the spring and autumn transition periods when ice roads are unsafe but river navigation has not yet opened, Yakutia experiences a supply gap that requires careful planning and stockpiling to navigate. The traditional practice of maintaining substantial food reserves, putting up enough preserved, fermented, and frozen food to last through periods of isolation, has not become obsolete in the modern era. It has simply been updated to include imported pasta alongside dried fish. A quirky detail that perfectly illustrates the intersection of traditional knowledge and modern life in Yakutian food culture. In Yakutsk, there are outdoor markets, functioning year-round, including in the depths of winter, where fresh meat and fish are sold frozen solid, displayed on open-air stalls at ambient temperature, which in January is a more effective preservation environment than any commercial refrigerator. The vendors at these markets stand bundled in their heaviest clothing, their breath frosting in the cold air, selling cuts of horse and beef and reindeer and fish that are frozen to the consistency of wood and will keep indefinitely in the Yakutian January air. There is no refrigeration unit required. The weather is the refrigerator. The freezer section of the outdoor market is everywhere. Historians still argue whether the specific dietary practices of the Yakutian people represent a primarily biological adaptation, with some research suggesting that populations with deep histories in cold environments show metabolic differences in how they process certain types of fat, or whether the adaptation is entirely cultural and behavioral, a learned system of food choices and preparation practices that any human body could theoretically adopt given sufficient time and instruction. The answer almost certainly involves both, braided together over generations in the way that biological and cultural evolution tend to be braided in long-established human populations, but the relative contributions are genuinely uncertain and the subject of ongoing research. What is certain is that the food of Yakutia is not poverty food or deprivation food, despite the harshness of the environment that shaped it. It is a cuisine in the fullest sense, a coherent system of ingredients, techniques, flavors, and social meanings that has developed over centuries in response to specific conditions, and that reflects the values, history, and ecological knowledge of the people who created it. The frozen fish on its wooden board, the simmering horsemeat broth, the tang of fermented mare's milk in a cup passed from hand to hand at a gathering. These are not compromises. They are the food of a people who understood their environment well enough to eat it on their own terms, which is the definition of cuisine anywhere in the world. The stove crackles softly. Outside, something deeply frozen is holding the world in place. And in the kitchen, someone is cutting stroganina with a practiced hand, thin curling shavings of frozen fish catching the lamplight as they fall. The wind arrives before the cold does. This is the thing that experienced Yakutians will tell you if you ask them what the wind means here. Not the meteorological explanation, not the physics of pressure differentials and Arctic air masses, but the lived, accumulated, bone-deep understanding that the wind is always the announcement, always the forerunner, always the voice that speaks before the full weight of the cold settles in. You hear the wind shake the walls of the house long before the temperature outside drops to its lowest point, and after enough winters you begin to understand the difference between the winds, the ones that carry merely severe cold, and the ones that carry something closer to annihilation. The Saka people have been listening to this difference for hundreds of years, and what they built from that listening is one of the most intricate and fascinating relationships between a human culture and its natural environment that exists anywhere on Earth. The spiritual and folkloric world of the Saka is not a quaint collection of old stories preserved in amber for the benefit of cultural tourism. It is a living, functional interpretive system, a way of making sense of an environment so extreme and so demanding that purely material explanations, while accurate as far as they go, have never quite seemed sufficient to the people who actually live inside it. When the wind shakes the walls at -60°C and the temperature outside is capable of killing any living thing that is not sheltered or prepared, the question of what the wind is, in the deepest sense, what it wants, what it is saying, what obligation it places on the people inside the warm walls, is not a superstitious distraction from practical survival. It is, in the Saka understanding, an extension of practical survival, because the practical and the spiritual are not separated in this worldview the way they tend to be in the post-Enlightenment Western tradition. They are the same conversation conducted in different registers. The Saka cosmological system, as we touched on earlier when we were tracing the origins and migrations of the Saka people, organizes the world into 3 vertical layers: the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. Each layer is populated by its own beings and governed by its own logic. But what is particularly relevant to the relationship between the Saka and the wind and the cold is the organization of the middle world, the human world, the world of ordinary experience, which in Saka cosmology is not a passive backdrop for human activity but a densely populated landscape of spirits, each associated with a specific feature of the natural environment. Rivers have spirits. Mountains have spirits. Individual trees have spirits. The wind has spirits. The cold has spirits. And crucially, these spirits are not distant, abstract forces operating on a cosmic scale beyond the concerns of daily life. They are immediate, local, responsive, and, this is the key point, they can be communicated with. The spirit of the wind in Saka tradition is not a single entity but a category of beings with distinct characters and associations depending on the direction, season, and character of the wind in question. The north wind, which brings the deepest cold and the most dangerous conditions, is associated with spirits of a severe and demanding nature, not evil in the simple moral sense, but uncompromising in their requirements. To go out into a north wind without the proper preparation, physical but also ritual and psychological, was to enter a negotiation with powerful beings in a state of poor preparation, which was as inadvisable in spiritual terms as it was in practical ones. The south wind, which in Yakutia's continental climate can carry surprising warmth even in winter, has a different spiritual character, associated with the benevolent sky spirits of the upper world, with renewal and the coming of summer, with the particular quality of light that accompanies a warming wind after a long cold spell. The concept of I, a spirit owner or master of a natural feature, is central to Saka relationship with the environment and is particularly important in understanding how the Saka experience the wind and the cold. Every significant natural feature has its I, its master spirit, whose relationship with humans is one of conditional generosity. The spirit provides, allows hunting in its territory, permits travel across its domain, moderates the severity of its natural force within the bounds of what humans can survive, in exchange for proper acknowledgement, respect, and reciprocal offering. When a Saka hunter went out onto the river ice, he did not simply go. He acknowledged the eye of the river, expressed his intention, and made some gesture of reciprocity. A small offering, a specific word, a ritual act, that maintained the relationship between himself and the spirit world in good standing. This was not separable from the practical act of hunting. It was part of it, as essential as checking that your clothing was properly fastened. The shaman, the Alganur, was the specialist in these negotiations, the person whose training and initiation had given them the capacity to communicate with the spirit world directly and to intervene on behalf of the community when the relationship between the human and spirit worlds had become disrupted. Shamanic initiation in Saka tradition was understood to be not a career choice but a calling, often experienced as a severe and involuntary crisis, a period of illness, visions, and psychological destabilization that the community recognized as the spirits selecting their intermediary. The candidate had no real option of refusal. To refuse the call of the spirits was itself understood to be dangerous, likely to result in continued illness or worse. The initiation process that followed involved extended training under an established shaman, the acquisition of ritual knowledge and technique, and ultimately a ceremonial recognition by the community of the new shaman's status and capacity. The ritual costume of a Saka shaman was extraordinary, and here we encounter one of the truly spectacular material culture objects of the indigenous Siberian world. The shaman's coat was not merely clothing but a cosmological map, a three-dimensional representation of the shaman's relationship with all three layers of the world. Metal attachments on the coat represented bones, the shaman's spiritual skeleton, the structural framework of their capacity for interworld travel. Bird feathers and imagery represented the ability to fly between worlds. The coat's weight, which could be considerable given the quantity of metal attachments, was understood as a test and a demonstration of the shaman's physical and spiritual stamina. A light shaman's coat was the coat of a beginner, while the coat of a powerful, experienced shaman was so heavy with accumulated metal ornaments that wearing it required significant physical strength. The drum, the dungur, was equally important, its rhythmic beating the sonic technology of the shamanic journey, a vibration that carried the shaman's consciousness between the layers of the world while their body remained present in the middle world. There is a quirky and wonderful detail in the folklore surrounding Saka shamanic practice that has been noted by ethnographers since the 19th century. The belief that a powerful shaman soul could be hidden outside their body for safekeeping, stored in an animal, a tree, or even a natural feature like a rock or a section of river, and that finding and destroying this external soul container was the only way to truly kill a powerful shaman. This concept, which scholars of comparative folklore will recognize as a version of the external soul motif found in folk traditions across an enormous range of cultures from Norse mythology to South Asian folk tales, takes on a particularly Yakutian character in the Saka version, where the hiding places for shamanic souls are typically features of the specific Yakutian landscape, the old larch tree in a particular bend of a particular river, the specific rock outcropping on the north face of a specific hill. The landscape and the spiritual power are inseparable, the soul hidden in the geography itself. The wind's role in Saka folklore extends well beyond the shamanic tradition into the broader body of oral literature and folk belief that pervades daily life. In Saka folk belief, wind carries the voices of ancestors, the dead who have moved on to other layers of the world, but who remain in communication with the living through natural phenomena. A sudden gust of wind in a calm period might be an ancestor drawing attention to something that needed noticing. A sustained wind during a period of illness might be a sign that the relationship between the family and its ancestral spirits required attention. The reading of wind as communication, as a form of language directed from the spirit world to the human world, was not a passive or passive mystical practice but an active interpretive one, requiring knowledge, attentiveness, and the willingness to act on what was read. The Elanco epics that we discussed in the context of Saka cultural identity are full of wind imagery, and the wind in these epics is almost never merely atmospheric. It is agentive, purposeful, directed. Heroes are warned by winds. Enemies are announced by particular wind patterns. The arrival of supernatural beings is heralded by specific types of wind that the heroes in the stories recognize and respond to. The wind is the primary communication medium of the Yakutian spirit world, the channel through which information and warning and presence travel between the layers of existence, and the Olankosut who performed these epics did so with vocal techniques that included wind-like sounds, the kind of tonal, breathy vocalization that fills the performance space with something that feels, to an attentive listener, genuinely elemental. Hearing a skilled Olankosut perform on a winter night, with the actual wind outside providing an ambient counterpoint to the performed wind within, is reportedly an experience of considerable power. The relationship between the Saka spiritual world and the natural environment has been complicated and partially disrupted by the historical forces we will examine in the next section, specifically by the Soviet period, during which active suppression of indigenous religious practice was official policy. But the worldview that produced this relationship, the fundamental orientation toward nature as communicative, as populated by intentional beings, as requiring relationship rather than merely management, has proven more resilient than the specific institutional practices of shamanism. Contemporary Saka people, including many who were educated in the secular Soviet tradition and who identify primarily with modern Russian culture, often describe experiences of the wind and the cold and the taiga that carry the unmistakable coloring of the older worldview. The sense that the landscape is attentive, that the wind is saying something, that there is a quality of presence in the Yakutian winter night that is not adequately described by purely meteorological language. Historians still argue whether this persistence of animistic sensibility represents genuine cultural continuity with pre-Soviet Saka spiritual practice, or whether it is better understood as a universal human tendency to perceive agency in powerful natural forces. A tendency that the extreme conditions of the Yakutian environment simply reinforce more strongly than most environments do. The distinction matters theoretically, but in practice, standing outside on a still January night in Yakutia when the temperature is below -55°C and the stars are absolutely clear and the taiga is cracking its slow cold music all around you, the question of whether the presence you feel is a spirit in the traditional sense or a projection of a universal human cognitive tendency feels somewhat academic. Something is there. The Saka have always known this. The wind carries it, and the walls, if you listen carefully enough, carry it too. Tonight the wind is doing what it does, testing the seams of the world, pressing against every surface with patient, relentless inquiry, shaking the walls in that particular low frequency that is more vibration than sound. Inside, a lamp burns and someone is listening, not passively, not with anxiety, but with the attentive, receptive quality of a person who has learned that the wind sometimes has something to say, and that the proper response to a world that speaks is to develop the capacity to hear it. The permafrost remembers everything. This is not poetry. It is the literal, physical truth of what permafrost does. It preserves. It locks in. It holds the record of whatever was pressed into it with a fidelity that no human archive can match. And in Yakutia, what the permafrost locked in during the 20th century was some of the darkest material of the Soviet experience. The Gulag, the forced labor camps, the disappeared. The bones of people who were sent here not because Yakutia was their home but because Yakutia was, from the perspective of the Soviet security apparatus, the end of the line, the place so remote, so cold, so logistically inaccessible that a person sent there could be effectively erased from the world of the living without the administrative inconvenience of formal execution. The permafrost received them and the permafrost kept them, and now, as the permafrost slowly warms and shifts, it is beginning, in some locations, to give them back. The history of the Soviet Gulag in Yakutia is not a peripheral footnote to the broader story of Stalinist repression. It is one of the central chapters. The Kolyma region, technically in neighboring Magadan Oblast but deeply connected to Yakutia geographically, climatically, and historically, was home to some of the most brutal and lethal of all the Gulag camps, where mortality rates during the worst periods of the late 1930s and early 1940s reached levels that make the word catastrophic feel inadequate. But Yakutia itself was also extensively developed as a forced labor region, with camps scattered across the territory whose purpose was to extract the mineral wealth, the gold, the coal, the tin, that lay beneath the permafrost and that the Soviet state needed with an urgency that recognized no human cost as prohibitive. The scale of what was built on forced labor in Yakutia is staggering. Roads, mines, processing facilities, entire towns. The infrastructure that made the exploitation of Yakutia's resources possible during the Soviet period was constructed largely by the hands of prisoners, many of whom died in the process and were buried in the permafrost near where they fell, their graves unmarked or marked with simple wooden stakes that the decades have since rotted away. The labor force in the Yakutia camps was drawn from across the Soviet Union and beyond: political prisoners, so-called kulaks displaced by collectivization, ethnic minorities deemed unreliable by the Soviet security apparatus, ordinary criminals serving sentences inflated to the point of lethality, foreign nationals caught in the sweep of Soviet paranoia during the purges of the 1930s. They arrived in a place they had never chosen and could not leave, and they were put to work in conditions that even the most hardened Yakutian resident, accustomed from birth to the realities of the cold, would recognize as deliberately murderous. The cold was not incidental to the Gulag experience in Yakutia, it was a tool. Camp authorities understood that the Yakutian winter was an enforcer that required no salary and took no days off. Prisoners who attempted to escape in winter faced a choice between the camp and the taiga at minus 50 degrees Celsius. And the taiga in January was not a realistic option for an underfed, underclothed person without local knowledge or survival equipment. The very extremity of the environment that makes Yakutia so remarkable as a place where people have chosen to live was systematically weaponized against people who had not chosen to be there and who were given none of the accumulated cultural knowledge, the proper clothing, the community support, or the seasonal preparation that made survival in this environment possible for those who belonged to it. The Saka people, whose own relationship with the Soviet state was complex and often painful, watched this happen in their homeland. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, the establishment of camps, the deaths, the transformation of the Yakutian landscape by forced labor, and the experience left marks on the community and on the land that have not fully healed. The relationship between the Soviet state and the Saka people themselves was a specific and layered form of the broader Soviet relationship with indigenous peoples, a mixture of genuine material development and violent cultural suppression that resists simple characterization. The Soviet state built schools in Yakutia, extended literacy, constructed hospitals, established the infrastructure of a modern regional economy, and created institutions of Saka cultural life, including a written literary tradition in the Saka language, publishing houses, and eventually academic institutions devoted to the study of Saka history and culture. These were real accomplishments with real positive effects on quality and length of life for many Saka people, and the historical record requires acknowledging them alongside the darker elements of the Soviet period. But the same Soviet state that built the schools also systematically dismantled the religious and spiritual institutions that were the foundation of Saka cultural identity. Shamans were arrested. Some were executed. The ritual objects that were the material embodiment of centuries of spiritual knowledge were confiscated and sent to museums in Moscow and Leningrad, or simply destroyed. The Elanco tradition, which had sustained Saka cultural identity through the long winters for generations, was initially suppressed as a relic of pre-socialist consciousness and then awkwardly rehabilitated when Soviet cultural policy decided that indigenous folk traditions could be tolerated, even celebrated, as long as they were stripped of their religious content and repackaged as secular cultural heritage. The result was a version of Saka culture that had been processed through the Soviet ideological apparatus, preserved in form while its spiritual substance was officially denied. Collectivization hit the Saka in ways that were specific to their particular economic and cultural system. The Saka were pastoralists. Their wealth, their social organization, and their practical survival strategy were all organized around the ownership and management of horses and cattle. Collectivization, which forcibly dissolved individual and family ownership of livestock and consolidated animals into collective farms, was not merely an economic disruption. It was an attack on the fundamental structure of Saka life, dismantling the relationships between families and animals that had been built and maintained across generations, and that carried enormous social, cultural, and spiritual significance alongside their practical economic function. The Yakutian horse, that remarkable cold-adapted animal whose properties we have already discussed, was particularly affected, with population numbers declining dramatically during collectivization as animals were redistributed, mismanaged by people without the specialized knowledge required to keep them healthy in Yakutian conditions, or simply lost to the chaos of the process. There was armed resistance. The period following the Bolshevik Revolution and the consolidation of Soviet power in Yakutia was not a peaceful one, and the resistance to Soviet rule took both military and cultural forms. A guerrilla movement known by the Soviet authorities as the Yakut Revolt engaged Red Army forces across the territory in the early 1920s, drawing on the knowledge of the landscape and the capacity for independent operation in extreme conditions that Saka fighters possessed and that outside forces could not easily match. The revolt was eventually suppressed, but not quickly and not without significant cost, and the Soviet approach to Yakutia in its aftermath was shaped by the understanding that the territory and its people required careful management rather than simple imposition. The particular accommodation that eventually emerged, the designation of Yakutia as an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, with certain formal recognitions of Saka national identity within the Soviet framework, was in part a consequence of this early resistance. Historians still argue whether the Soviet development of Yakutia represented, on balance, a net benefit or a net harm to the Saka people and the region. The question is genuinely complex, because the ledger contains entries of such different moral and material weights that any simple summation feels dishonest. The infrastructure, the education, the medical care, the extension of life expectancy, these are real and significant. The Gulag deaths, the cultural suppression, the environmental damage from Soviet-era industrial activity, the disruption of traditional life, these are also real and significant. The answer that most Saka historians and community members tend to arrive at is something like, both things are true, the good and the terrible, and the work of the present is to acknowledge both without allowing either to erase the other. The environmental legacy of Soviet industrialization in Yakutia is written into the landscape in ways that the permafrost has preserved with its characteristic fidelity. The diamond mines of Mirny, including the Mir mine, for many decades the largest diamond mine in the world by volume, an open pit so enormous that it generated its own weather systems and had to be closed to helicopter traffic because the updrafts from the pit were strong enough to pull small aircraft down into it, represent the most dramatic example of Soviet and post-Soviet industrial transformation of the Yakutian landscape. The Mir mine is now inactive, but its pit remains, an almost perfectly circular hole nearly 600 meters deep and 1,200 meters across, visible from space, an industrial monument to the scale of what the Soviet and Russian state was willing to do to the Yakutian landscape in pursuit of what lay beneath it. There is a quirky detail that captures something of the strange relationship between Soviet industrial ambition and the Yakutian environment. In the early days of diamond mining operations in Yakutia, Soviet engineers discovered that the permafrost itself was one of their primary engineering challenges, but also, in a specific way, one of their most useful tools. The practice of hydraulic mining, using high-pressure water jets to break up and move frozen ground, was adapted for Yakutian conditions, and in summer, when the active layer had thawed, enormous quantities of water were used to strip away overburden and expose the kimberlite pipes where diamonds were found. In winter, the same permafrost that made summer mining difficult provided a natural stability to the pit walls that no engineered structure could have matched. The mine and the permafrost negotiated their relationship over decades, and the mine, having extracted what it came for, eventually withdrew. The permafrost, as always, remains. The Soviet shadow over Yakutia is long, and it falls across the contemporary landscape in ways that are sometimes literal. The abandoned industrial facilities, the crumbling concrete of former campsites, the ghost towns of settlements that were established for a specific industrial purpose that no longer exists and that have been depopulating ever since. But the shadow also falls across the cultural and psychological landscape of the Saka people. In the complex and sometimes painful work of reassembling an identity that was systematically dismantled and imperfectly reassembled over the course of 7 decades. The cultural revival that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union was genuine and energetic. The Saka invested deeply in the recovery and development of their language, their artistic traditions, their spiritual practices, but revival is not the same as unbroken continuity, and the gaps in the record, the knowledge that was lost with the shamans who were killed or who died without being able to pass on their full understanding, are real losses that no amount of post-Soviet enthusiasm can entirely fill. The permafrost holds the record. It holds the bones of Gulag prisoners and the remnants of ancient mammals and the compressed organic matter of forests that grew and fell before the first human being walked in this landscape. It holds the cold patiently, as it has always held it, and it does not editorialize. It simply keeps. And in the keeping, it preserves something true about this place, that beneath the surface of the present, there are layers upon layers of what came before, waiting for the conditions that will bring them back into the light. Your phone works in Yakutsk. This seems like it should not be surprising. Phones work almost everywhere now, and the assumption that connectivity follows civilization is so deeply embedded in the modern mindset that it barely registers as an assumption anymore. But standing in Yakutsk at minus 55 degrees Celsius, watching the battery indicator on your smartphone drop from 30% to dead in approximately 4 minutes because lithium-ion batteries lose their charge-holding capacity catastrophically in extreme cold, you begin to appreciate that the relationship between modern technology and the Yakutian winter is less a triumph of civilization over nature and more an ongoing negotiation in which nature retains significant leverage. Yakutsk residents carry their phones inside their clothing, close to their bodies, using body heat to keep the batteries functional. They have adapted their relationship with a piece of technology that was designed for a temperate zone world to the specific demands of a place that temperate zone engineers did not have in mind when they were making their design choices. This is, in miniature, the story of modern Yakutsk, a place that is fully, enthusiastically, sometimes surreally engaged with contemporary global culture while simultaneously operating under physical constraints that the rest of that global culture has never had to think about. The school run in Yakutsk deserves its own documentary, and in the age of YouTube it has essentially received one. Multiple ones, in fact, filmed by local residents and visiting journalists and curious outsiders who cannot quite believe what they are watching. On mornings when the temperature sits at minus 55 degrees Celsius or minus 58 degrees Celsius, parents and children move through the streets of Yakutsk with the bundled, efficient purposefulness of people who have internalized the relevant danger and whose response to it is not panic but procedure. Children are wrapped with a thoroughness that makes them appear roughly spherical, every layer in its correct place, faces covered to the maximum extent compatible with forward vision, boots double-checked before departure. The walk to school, if it is more than a few minutes, is conducted briskly, with the specific kind of brisk that is not exercise enthusiasm but thermal management, because stopping and standing in a Yakutian winter morning at minus 55 degrees Celsius is a significantly worse option than moving. The schools themselves are heated to a degree that outside visitors find stifling. The interior temperature of a Yakutsk school in January is typically maintained at a level that compensates for the brief but extreme cold exposure of the journey to get there. At minus 52 degrees Celsius, a threshold that has been set through a combination of official guidance and accumulated community experience, children in most Yakutsk schools are kept home. This is the cold day equivalent of a snow day in temperate climates, the point at which the calculation of risk versus educational value tips decisively towards staying inside. But below minus 52 degrees Celsius, school continues. Life continues. The cafes in the center of Yakutsk continue to serve coffee and pastries to customers who come in from the street trailing clouds of ice fog, the sudden condensation of moisture-laden indoor air meeting the sub-zero cold that clings to every surface of a person who has just come in from outside. The restaurants continue to serve dinner. The theaters continue their performances. The university continues its lectures. The bureaucracies of the city and the republic continue their paperwork. The normality of Yakutsk in deep winter is, from the outside, one of the most consistently astonishing things about it. The sheer, determined, almost cheerful refusal to treat conditions that would shut down most of the world's cities as anything other than Tuesday. Ice fog is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most visually distinctive features of Yakutsk in deep winter and one of the most physically consequential. Ice fog forms when the air temperature is so low, typically below minus 40 degrees Celsius or so, that the moisture produced by human activity in the city, including the exhaust from vehicles, the steam from heating systems, and the breath of hundreds of thousands of people, freezes into tiny suspended ice crystals rather than dispersing as vapor. The result is a fog that is not water but ice. A dense, gray-white haze that hangs over the city at street level and reduces visibility significantly. On the coldest mornings in Yakutsk, the ice fog can be so thick that familiar streets become disorienting, landmarks disappearing into the white murk at distances of 100 meters or less. The ice crystals in the fog are small enough to inhale, and breathing ice fog is an experience that long-term Yakutsk residents describe as a specific physical sensation. A faint, cold crystalline feeling in the upper respiratory tract that is entirely distinct from ordinary cold air. It is also a health concern, particularly for people with respiratory conditions, which is one of several reasons that the deep winter cold in Yakutsk is taken seriously as a public health matter rather than merely a personal inconvenience. The cars of Yakutsk have their own relationship with the cold that is simultaneously practical, expensive, and faintly comic from the outside. Gasoline-powered vehicles in Yakutia require specially formulated fuels that remain liquid at temperatures far below what standard automotive fuel can handle. Engine oils must be Arctic-grade, capable of flowing at -50 degrees Celsius or colder. Batteries must be oversized to compensate for the reduced chemical activity in cold temperatures. Many vehicles in Yakutsk are equipped with engine block heaters, electric heating elements that keep the engine warm when the vehicle is parked, and the electric outlets for these heaters are as standard a feature of Yakutsk parking infrastructure as parking meters are in other cities. A car that has been left outside unplugged for several hours at -50 degrees Celsius may simply not start. The engine oil has congealed, the battery has discharged, and the entire mechanical system has entered a state of cold-induced torpor from which no amount of turning the key will revive it without external intervention. Many Yakutsk residents, if they must park outside overnight in deep winter, leave their engines running. A practice that would be environmentally and economically absurd in any other context, but that in Yakutsk is a straightforward calculation between fuel cost and the alternative, which is an immobile car at temperatures that make waiting for a tow truck a medically inadvisable activity. The rise of social media and video platforms has given Yakutia a global audience that it did not previously have, and the region has embraced this attention with a spirit of proud, occasionally mischievous showmanship. The boiling water trick, throwing a pot of hot water into the air at -50 degrees Celsius and watching it explode into snow, that we mentioned in the opening of tonight's story, has been filmed thousands of times and watched tens of millions of times, and it never seems to exhaust the appetite of viewers who find the simple physics of it endlessly satisfying. Yakutian influencers and content creators have built substantial followings by documenting daily life in extreme cold. The morning routine, the clothing ritual, the car-starting drama, the ice fog commute, and the response from global audiences is consistently a mixture of incredulity, admiration, and a specific kind of existential relief. The warm climate viewers' gratitude for the reminder that their own winter, however unpleasant it might feel in the moment, is nowhere near Yakutia. Yakutsk has a thriving food scene that reflects both the traditional Saka culinary heritage we explored earlier and the full range of contemporary global food culture. There are restaurants in Yakutsk that serve elegant versions of traditional Saka dishes, the stroganina elevated to fine dining with careful presentation and premium ingredients, the horse meat preparations treated with the seriousness of a cuisine rather than the utility of sustenance. There are also sushi restaurants, pizza places, Georgian cuisine establishments, Chinese restaurants, and the full familiar catalog of global fast food that has penetrated even the most remote corners of the connected world. The juxtaposition of a bowl of frozen raw fish cut tableside by a skilled Saka chef and a delivery app notification for Korean fried chicken is not experienced as contradictory in modern Yakutsk. It is simply the texture of contemporary life in a place that is simultaneously ancient and modern, local and global, unlike anywhere else and completely recognizable. The Yakutian film industry is a genuine cultural phenomenon that deserves more international attention than it typically receives. Yakutia produces a disproportionate number of films relative to its population, a fact that has been noted with some bemusement by the broader Russian film industry, and many of these films engage directly with the specific conditions of Yakutian life, the landscape, the cold, the intersection of traditional Saka culture and modern Russian reality, and the particular psychological textures of existence in extreme isolation and extreme cold. Yakutian cinema has developed its own aesthetic, characterized by long takes, minimal dialogue, and attention to the physical reality of cold environments that no studio production could replicate, and a willingness to engage with the spiritual dimensions of the Saka worldview without either sensationalizing or dismissing them. Several Yakutian films have won awards at international festivals and reached audiences far outside the region, introducing global viewers to a world that most had never imagined. The mainstream historical fact worth noting here is that Yakutsk is the coldest major city in the world by average winter temperature. Colder than Ulaanbaatar, colder than Norilsk, colder than any other city of comparable size on the planet, and that this distinction is reflected in the city's infrastructure in ways that go well beyond the stilted buildings and the above-ground pipes. The airport at Yakutsk is one of the busiest in the Russian Far East, handling flights that must operate in conditions no other commercial airport in the world routinely faces. The runway lighting and navigation systems are designed to function at temperatures that would render standard airport equipment non-operational. The aircraft that operate out of Yakutsk use Arctic-grade lubricants and are preheated before departure in the depths of winter. Their engines kept warm in heated hangars, or with external heating units while passengers board through enclosed jetways specifically designed to minimize cold exposure during the transition between terminal and aircraft. The logistics of maintaining a major air hub at these temperatures are extraordinary, and the fact that it operates as reliably as it does is a tribute to the engineering ingenuity and operational discipline that Yakutia has developed out of sheer necessity. The healthcare system in Yakutsk faces challenges that are specific to extreme cold. Frostbite treatment is a routine medical specialty rather than an occasional emergency, and the emergency medical services of the city have protocols and equipment calibrated for the specific risks of cold exposure that would be unnecessary in any other major city. There is also a long tradition of research into the physiology of cold adaptation in Yakutia, with the Institute for Health in the North in Yakutsk being one of the world's leading centers for the study of how human bodies adapt to chronic cold exposure, what the long-term health effects of living in extreme cold environments are, and what interventions are most effective for the specific health challenges of the Yakutian population. The research produced by this institution and its predecessors has contributed significantly to the global understanding of cold physiology, and is one of the ways in which Yakutia's extreme conditions have generated scientific knowledge that benefits people far beyond the region. Historians still argue whether the Soviet decision to invest in Yakutsk as a major administrative and industrial center, rather than maintaining a minimal presence focused purely on resource extraction, was a strategically rational choice given the costs involved, or whether it reflected the particular Soviet ideological commitment to demonstrating that socialist development could transform even the most extreme environments into productive socialist spaces. What is not in dispute is that the investment produced a real city, with real cultural and intellectual life, that has now developed its own momentum and identity entirely independent of whatever Soviet ideological calculations originally motivated its construction. Yakutsk does not need Soviet ideology to justify its existence. It exists because people live here, because people have chosen to live here, and because the life they have built in this extraordinary place is, by every measure that matters, genuinely worth living. The evening in Yakutsk is settling in around you now. The ice fog is thickening slightly in the streets below, catching the orange light of the street lamps and diffusing it into a soft, glowing haze. Somewhere in the city, a Yakutian film is being shot, the director bundled in every layer they own, the camera equipped with special cold weather housing, the actors moving through the ice fog with the practiced ease of people who have never known a winter that was any different. A restaurant is serving stroganina to a table of people who are laughing about something, their coats piled on a chair nearby, the warmth of the interior fogging the windows against the dark cold outside. A child is being read to sleep in an apartment elevated on its concrete stilts above the permafrost, and the wind outside is doing what it always does, pressing against the walls, testing the seams, reminding everyone inside that the world beyond the glass is still very much itself. The deepest cold comes without announcement. This is the thing that surprises people who have not experienced it, the assumption, reasonable from a temperate climate perspective, that the most extreme conditions would arrive with some kind of atmospheric fanfare, some building of pressure or darkening of sky that would serve as adequate warning. But in Yakutia, the nights that reach the most profound cold are often the clearest and the stillest. The wind drops, the sky empties of cloud until it is nothing but a vast, transparent darkness through which the stars burn with a clarity and density that feels almost aggressive, as though the universe is showing off in the absence of any atmospheric interference. The ice fog that hangs over the city in slightly less cold conditions has itself frozen out of the air, leaving the streets crystalline and sharp-edged under the lamplight. And the temperature, freed from the moderating influence of cloud cover and unimpeded by any wind, simply falls and keeps falling with the patient, inexorable quality of something that has all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. You have been in Yakutia tonight for the length of a long story, and now you are approaching the end of it. The deepest, quietest part of the winter night, the hour when the city is as close to silence as a city of 350,000 people ever gets, and when the cold outside has reached the kind of depth that changes the quality of everything. The stilted buildings stand in their rows, their ventilated undersides open to the night air, the permafrost beneath them holding as it has held through every winter of the city's existence. The heating pipes thread their orange-wrapped warmth through the streets above ground, and the contrast between the warmth inside them and the air outside is so extreme that the pipes are faintly audible in the deep quiet. A soft tick and groan of metal managing the thermal stress of the differential, a mechanical heartbeat in the frozen city. What does it mean to call a place like this home? This is the question that accumulates across everything we have seen tonight. The physics of the cold, the engineering of the buildings, the clothing and the food and the spiritual traditions and the dark history and the improbable normalcy of contemporary life. And it is a question that does not resolve into a simple answer. Home, for the Saka people who have lived here for hundreds of years, is not a compromise or a consolation. It is a specific place with a specific character, a landscape that has shaped their language and their cosmology and their cuisine and their art. A cold that is not merely a condition to be endured but a presence to be understood and related to. The wind that shakes the walls is not an adversary. It is a neighbor, demanding, sometimes dangerous, but familiar in the way that only something you have lived alongside for your entire life can be familiar. The Saka word for homeland, Diedu in the Saka language, pronounced roughly as Doidu, carries connotations that go significantly beyond the simple territorial meaning of the English word. Doidu encompasses the land, the ancestors buried in it, the spirits that inhabit its natural features, the community of living people who share it, and the obligations that all of these relationships create. To have a Doidu is not simply to have an address. It is to be woven into a web of relationship with the past, with the non-human world, with the other people who belong to the same place, that defines who you are in the most fundamental sense. The cold is part of this. The Lena is part of this. The taiga and the permafrost and the wind and the long dark winter and the astonishing brief summer are all part of this. You cannot subtract the extreme environment from the identity of the Saka people and have anything coherent left, because the identity was formed in direct, continuous, generational response to that environment. For the people who came here later, the Russians who arrived with the Cossack frontier in the 17th century, the Soviet administrators and workers, and involuntarily the Gulag prisoners of the 20th century, the contemporary migrants who come for economic opportunity or professional assignment, the relationship with the place is different but not necessarily less real. There is something that happens to people who spend significant time in Yakutia, a process that long-term residents describe in ways that are consistent enough to constitute a pattern. An initial period of shock and resistance, during which the cold feels purely hostile and the environment feels purely alien. A gradual accommodation, during which the specific pleasures of the place begin to assert themselves, the extraordinary clarity of cold weather air, the beauty of the winter light, the particular quality of community that develops among people who face shared extreme conditions, and eventually, for many, something that can only be described as attachment, a pull that brings people back when they have left and that makes the prospect of permanent departure feel like a loss of something essential. The stars over Yakutia tonight are doing what Yakutian stars do on the clearest, coldest nights, performing with an extravagance that feels personal, as though the sky has decided that if it is going to be this cold it might as well be spectacular about it. The Milky Way is a river of light across the zenith, thicker and more detailed than any version of it visible from any light-polluted temperate zone city, and the individual stars at its edges are not points but presences, each one burning with a steadiness that the wavering, atmospheric distortion-afflicted stars of warmer, moister climates cannot match. In Saka cosmology, the Milky Way has its own identity and its own stories. It is the pathway of spirits moving between the layers of the world, the road along which the ancestors travel, the visible evidence of the upper world's proximity on the clearest nights of winter. Looking up at it from inside Yakutia, with the cold pressing in from every direction and the stars burning overhead with their preposterous clarity, it is genuinely difficult to find this interpretation less convincing than the astronomical one. Both are true. The sky is full of hydrogen fusing at unimaginable temperatures in the cores of stars millions of light years away, and the road of the ancestors crosses the zenith on the coldest night of the year. These things are not incompatible. The resilience that Yakutia represents is not the dramatic, crisis response kind of resilience that makes for exciting emergency narratives. It is the quieter, deeper, more interesting kind, the resilience of ordinary life sustained under extraordinary conditions, day after day, generation after generation, without heroic posturing or existential complaint. The child who goes to school at -40°C is not performing courage. The woman cutting stroganina in her kitchen is not demonstrating survival instinct. The engineer monitoring the thermal sensors in the permafrost beneath a residential building is not engaged in an act of exceptional bravery. They are simply living their lives, in the place where their lives are, with the knowledge and the tools and the community that make those lives possible. The heroism, if that word applies at all, is so thoroughly distributed across so many people and so many generations that it has dissolved into the texture of the ordinary, which is the only place that genuine, sustainable resilience ever actually lives. Historians still argue whether the human settlement of Yakutia represents a triumph of adaptability, evidence of the extraordinary plasticity of the human species, its capacity to inhabit virtually any environment on the planet given sufficient time and cultural development, or whether it represents something more specific, the particular genius of the Saka people, whose specific cultural and possibly biological adaptations to the cold are not simply a general human capacity applied to a challenging environment but a unique achievement that could not have been replicated by any group of people dropped into this landscape without their specific history and knowledge. The answer, as with most of the genuinely interesting historical questions we have touched on tonight, is probably both, and the fact that it is both makes it more interesting rather than less. The Yakutian horse is standing in a field somewhere outside the city right now, its thick winter coat fully deployed, its compact body managing its thermal regulation with the quiet efficiency of a biology refined over centuries for exactly these conditions. The temperature around it is somewhere below -50 degrees Celsius, and it is fine. Not merely surviving fine. Its metabolism is ticking over at the rate appropriate to its circumstances, its blood chemistry calibrated for the cold, its hooves finding purchase in the frozen ground with the sure-footedness of an animal that has never known a winter that was any different. It is not thinking about the cold because it does not have the cognitive apparatus for that kind of reflexive relationship with its own circumstances, and in this it is perhaps freer than the humans who share its landscape, free of the specifically human burden of knowing how extreme the situation is, of understanding the physics and the statistics and the historical record of what cold like this can do. The humans know. This is the price of consciousness in a place like Yakutia. You know exactly how cold it is, exactly what the numbers mean, exactly what would happen to you without the layers of protection that culture and technology and community provide. You carry that knowledge always, a constant background awareness of the margin between comfort and catastrophe that is narrower here than almost anywhere else people have chosen to live. And yet the knowing does not produce paralysis or despair. It produces, in the people who have grown up with it, a specific quality of attentiveness, a sharpness of presence, a habit of noticing, an appreciation for warmth and light and company and food and all the other good things that are good everywhere but that are felt with particular intensity in a place where their absence is never an abstraction. The lamp in the window of a Yakutsk apartment burns against the dark. The heating pipe outside ticks softly in the cold. The permafrost holds its patient record of everything that has ever happened here, the ancient mammals and the human bones and the diamond pipes and the compressed memory of forests older than human civilization. The wind, for the moment, has gone quiet. This happens sometimes on the very coldest nights, when the air is so dense and still that it seems to have forgotten how to move. The silence that follows is extraordinary, not the comfortable silence of a warm interior, but a profound, physical, outdoor silence, the silence of a world that has been turned down to its lowest possible setting, that is operating at the very bottom of its register, close to the point where thermal motion itself approaches stillness. In the Saka tradition, this silence has meaning. It is the moment when the upper world and the middle world are closest together, when the membrane between the human world and the world of spirits is at its most permeable, when the ancestors on their starlit road are near enough to hear if you speak to them. It is the moment the Olankosut reaches for in performance, the deepest quiet before the hero speaks, before the spirit answers, before the story turns. It is the moment the shaman's drum falls silent between beats, and in that silence the shaman travels. You have traveled tonight too, in your way, across the physics of extreme cold and the engineering of frozen ground and the origins of a remarkable people and the layers of their clothing and the flavors of their food and the voices in their wind and the shadows of their history and the improbable, endearing normalcy of their contemporary life. You have been, for a few hours, a resident of the coldest inhabited place on Earth, and you have found it, perhaps surprisingly, not a place of pure hardship and endurance but a place of extraordinary richness. Rich in history, in culture, in spiritual depth, in the particular human warmth that accumulates most intensely in the places where the physical cold is most severe, as though the universe maintains some kind of compensation principle that the Yakutians discovered long ago and have been quietly benefiting from ever since. The cold outside is absolute tonight. The stars are burning, the walls are holding, and somewhere in the warm interior of a home elevated above the frozen ground, someone is already asleep, their breath rising and falling in the heated air, dreaming whatever dreams come to people who have made their peace with the most demanding landscape on earth. Now let the story settle around you like the warmth of a well-tended fire, like the weight of a heavy fur coat laid gently across your shoulders. The numbers on the thermometer outside mean nothing to you right now. You are inside, you are warm, and the cold is doing what it always does in Yakutia, waiting, patient and unhurried, on the other side of walls that are holding. The wind has gone quiet. The permafrost is dreaming its slow, geological dream beneath the city. The stars are still there, burning their ancient light through the crystalline Yakutian air, and the road of the ancestors stretches across the zenith in its river of soft light. And everything that has ever happened in this extraordinary place is held somewhere, preserved in the cold, waiting. Let your breath slow now, the way breath slows in a warm room when the body finally believes it is safe. Let the images of tonight soften at their edges. The stilted buildings, the frosted pipes, the shaman's heavy coat, the thin curling shavings of frozen fish, the trees cracking in the dark taiga, the child bundled to near spherical for the cold walk to school. Let them drift and dissolve, the way ice fog dissolves when the temperature lifts gently into something softer. The cold was always going to hold the world outside tonight. It always does. But in here, there is only warmth and quiet, and the long, unhurried dark of a Yakutian winter night settling over everything like the softest, heaviest snow, and you are safe inside it, and the walls are holding, and the wind has gone quiet, and it is time now to sleep.